Hey guys, CWHolo1 here. Welcome back to another video, and today I'm here with this MTH-built Lionel Corporate Tinplate 1835E with ProtoSound 2. Now, if Lionel and MTH both being in this engine's full name doesn't make any sense to you, allow me to explain. As you may know, Lionel was founded in the year 1900. Originally, they pioneered two-rail electric trains with DC motors, when most other companies at the time were creating wind-up trains. These trains were never intended for mass markets, they were mainly built for storefront displays. However, Joshua Lionel Cowan, the company's founder, in 1906 decided to create something called standard gauge. Standard gauge was in no way the standard, and no other companies actually used it. However, very quickly, thanks to some clever marketing, standard gauge did become the standard, and companies like Ives, American Flyer, and of course Lionel all used this gauge. Now, between 1906 and around 1940, Lionel created what you can see in front of you, tinplate toy trains. These were in no way meant to be realistic, they were just meant to be brightly colored, fun-looking trains that anyone could play with on the floor of their house. And while Lionel didn't coin the term toy train, by the time 1940 rolled around, most people associated toy trains with companies like Lionel, American Flyer, and Ives. In 1915, Lionel decided that they would try to create a smaller train, something that was cheaper to produce, more affordable for families, and would fit better in the smaller homes that were becoming more popular as the years went on. Based on their three-rail standard gauge architecture, Lionel created O-Gauge. O-Gauge was never expected to equal, let alone surpass, standard gauge in sales, but with the introduction of the 700E in 1937, as well as houses continuing to get smaller and O-Gauge becoming more affordable, it did surpass standard gauge in sales, and by the time 1940 rolled around, standard gauge wasn't making Lionel money anymore, and they decided to drop the line in favor of O-Scale. Now, obviously, the Great Depression had a huge impact on the economics of standard gauge. Standard gauge was just too expensive for people to afford, but what they could afford were the O-Gauge paper train or the O-Gauge Mickey and Minnie Mouse handcar, which was cheaper for Lionel to produce and thus cheaper for the consumers. So standard gauge sort of became this backseat item that nobody really purchased, and by the time 1940 rolled around, it was actually losing money for Lionel, so they decided to kill it off. Now, following World War II, the Lionel post-war era began. This is probably the most well-known era of Lionel, and it was when they created stuff like the 2020 Turbine, the 2353 Santa Fe, and similar models were all created during this era. While the models weren't full-scale like the 700E, they were semi-scale, and they were close enough to convey the concept of realism, while still being toys that were affordable for families that were growing, and could still be played with by kids where they would run them off the table, send them onto the floor, and pick them back up, and run them again for hours and hours and hours. As electronics improved throughout the late 1950s and 60s, Lionel decided to try to take those electronics and put them in their engines, and this began the MPC era for Lionel. This introduced things like rail sounds, where you could now get chugging effects and whistles inside of your locomotives, but still absent was standard gauge. But finally, in the 1980s, a guy named Richard Kuhn, who owned Lionel at the time, decided to reintroduce the standard gauge trains that had been absent from Lionel's lineup for about 4 decades. These engines would forego the quote-unquote fancy electronics of the MPC O-Gauge engines and instead opt for a true-to-original style of motor, lighting, and the basic toy train look. The Lionel Classic series recreated icons like the 400E Blue Comet, and it also went down into O-Gauge tinplate trains as well, with models like the 263, 260, 262, and others being recreated. Again, these engines didn't have sounds until roughly the late 90s, when Rail Sounds 3/4 and TMCC began to become available for these engines. At this time, Lionel created 2 standard gauge models that absolutely blew all others out of the water, and that was the Hiawatha with Rail Sounds 4 and the Commodore Vanderbilt. These were beautiful sets that looked realistic compared to the toy-like nature of the previous tinplate trains, and they operated just like any TMCC-equipped O-Gauge engine. These things were absolutely fantastic, but sort of fell on deaf ears because the people that were running the tinplate standard gauge trains didn't want a realistic look or didn't have Trainmaster command control. And as a result, only 2 engines with TMCC and rail sounds in standard gauge would ever be produced. Standard gauge trains would disappear from catalogs again for about another decade until December 31st, 2008, when Lionel officially announced that MTH, under contract with them, would be reproducing the Tinplate standard gauge trains. But these wouldn't be like the Lionel Classics or the Hiawatha or Commodore Vanderbilt. These would be a mixture of both. They would be a combination of the toy-like appearance and the original shape of the Tinplate trains from the pre-war era, with the modern electronics that MTH could offer, similar to the Hiawatha and Commodore Vanderbilt that Lionel produced. These engines would have ProtoSound 2, and that would give these things a much more realistic sound and ambience, while still maintaining the toy-like look that you can see in front of you. The agreement between MTH and Lionel would end in 2019, but in that time, MTH recreated some absolutely incredible models. Everything from the 1835E that you see here, to a bunch of different models of the 400E, all the way up to locomotives and rolling stock that was never really produced for public consumption, such as the Brute and the Showroom cars. Those things are absolute behemoths, and the fact that people own them today shows that there may have been a demand for them back then, but the modern electronics that are in them now make them such a different experience to what you would have had in the 1930s or 40s when they would have originally come out. The inclusion of smoke units and sound systems really elevated these models, but with those upgrades also came added complexity, and with complexity comes failures, and that is why this engine is here today. This engine will not move for some reason. I'm not an expert on MTH's DCS system, but today we're going to dive into this thing and see if we can figure out what's going on. So here's its current state. I'm going to power it up here. You see the smoke unit and the sounds come to life. Now if I power cycle this to make it go forward, that's new. It wanted to for a second, but then you see it stops. But if I move it by hand, which it does not like doing, you can see that it still chuffs. So the engine is clearly thinking that it's trying to move, as evident by the fact that it lurched and it chuffs, but it's just not doing it. So I'm going to take a guess and say there's a loose connection here to the motor, just based on that behavior, and we're going to pop this shell off the engine and take a look. So to remove the shell on this particular engine, I had to do it off camera because I needed to remember how to do it. There's 2 screws in the back of the cab here. There are 2 in the firebox. Down on the bottom, there's one there, and then one on the other side. And then there is one up in the smokestack up front, right in front of the outlet for the main smoke unit. And then you open the front lid, and the top just slides off like so. And here's what you're looking at. You can just remove the motor. It's hilarious how similar it is to the original Tinplate style. You can see it even has the bent over tabs to hold everything in place. But the original mounting, so on an old post-war engine, what you would do, or a pre-war standard gauge engine, you would just flip this tab over. There's one on each side of the motor, and then this whole motor just pulls out. Kind of wild. They also kept the original plate, but they put their proto drive on it, which I think is kind of cool. So lots of nods to the original model. But now that we're in here, let's I'm gonna dig around a little bit and see if I can find anything that's like notably out of place. So I'm actually a little worried now because I just pinned it out, and between the motor's yellow wire and the yellow wire on the board that goes to the tender, I get good contact, and between the white wire and the white wire that goes to the tender, on the board that goes to the tender, I also have good contact. So the locomotive is not the problem, which means that the problem is with something having to do with DCS, probably. Which is fun, because I have no idea what I'm doing with that. So I'm going to keep the shell off. I'm going to put this back on the track, and we're going to take the tender shell off and see what the inside of that looks like. So I kind of want to test something. If I power this up, let it boot up for a second, power it down, power it back up. Still not moving. Do I have voltage at the motor? I have like 0.03 volts DC, which is not good. So, not getting power to the motor, which means that it is something with the tender. Alright, you and I are going to get a look at this together for the first time. There's just 6 screws, just like any other, and here's what we're looking at. It's actually not nearly as many electronics as I thought it would be. There are 2 potentiometers, I'm just now realizing. Oh, one's for smoke output. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. There's also this plug down here that I have no idea what that does. If any of you guys do MTH more often than I, which is at least once, if you know what that is, let me know. So, I guess I need to figure out what exactly is going on here. I guess I can start by tracing out the connector for the motor, figuring out where that goes on this board, and then we can go from there. It does have the capacitor bank in it, so I don't know, maybe after sitting for a while, if that goes completely dead, maybe it resets something on the board. I think the Proto 1s did that. If the battery goes below half voltage or something, it resets it, but I don't know. I'll dig around a little bit, letting you guys know what I find. So check this out. Right now, power it up. It's in neutral. Test my motor. Get negative 1.8 volts. Sure. Now if I make it move, or make it think that it's moving, look at that. 20 volts. So what that tells me is that the board is trying to tell the motor to move, but the motor is not seeing that voltage, which means that there's probably a break somewhere in this tether. So I'm just going to read the resistance across this, and if it's anything other than 0, I know that that's our problem. Alright, so here's what was happening. This board has an intermittent connection issue. So the white wire to the white wire for motor 1, I guess we'll call it, perfectly fine. Has no issues at all. The yellow to yellow connection wasn't working at all. And then I played with it a little bit, like I applied some pressure and moved the board around a little bit, and now all of a sudden it's working. And I can't get it to stop working, which I guess is a good thing, but it means I also can't duplicate whatever caused that issue in the first place, so I can't correct it, but I think we'll call it good for right now. This engine really doesn't come out that often, so I think it's fine. But just to make sure the motor works, let's power it up and see if I can get it to move on my little test track. So some stuff has happened. You can hear the engine is running currently. I tested it, it went forward and then it wouldn't go backwards, so I played around with it a little bit more and found that the pin in the connector itself had a bad connection to this board. So I went in with my soldering iron and I just melted the solder, basically, just let it kind of re-wick around that that connector in case it had broken free inside of there, and also let it soak back into the board. And it seems to have fixed the problem, so now it will go forward and it goes backwards. So that's pretty neat. I have no idea why the solder joint would fail like that. My guess is that at some point during the move, it like vibrated itself out and cracked the solder around it, but I'm not 100% sure. If that's a common issue with these engines, let me know in the comments down below. I'm curious, because if so, I should probably look out for that more often on some of the other what do you call it, Lionel Corporate Tinplate engines that I have. But yeah, anyway, I do have some standard gauge track. It's sitting on the floor behind me right now. So the one thing you want to make sure that you never ever do with engines like these, really any model train, is run them on nice, like, fluffy carpet. Two reasons. One, the carpet will get stuck in the gears of the motor and in the axles, and if that carpet traps hair, that hair will also get in there, and it causes all sorts of problems with the motor. Also, it can make your carpet really greasy. So with that disclaimer out of the way, yeah, here's my carpet layout. It's just 48-inch diameter curves, I think. I'm pretty sure that's what the normal standard gauge curves are. And then I've got 4 straight tracks on each side. But this is basically just to run it for laps and make sure that the fix stays fixed. So sit back and enjoy the scenery that is just my apartment. So there you have it. That was my relatively simple, in hindsight, repair to this Lionel Corporate Tinplate 1835E. Yeah, again, let me know in the comments if those pins going bad is a common problem. I'm new to DCS/ProtoSound/ pretty much anything MTH. I mainly do TMCC and legacy stuff. So if you have knowledge you'd like to share, please do. I'll take anything I can get. But yeah, I hope you all learned something too. Maybe about the history of these engines, how they built. Maybe you got to learn about the internals of the Lionel Corporate Tinplate engines specifically. So hopefully a little bit of knowledge gained there for you too. But yeah, anyway, I hope you all enjoyed. I am CW Hollow 1, and have a good day. Or maybe good night in your case. See ya. For the record, this is why I had the smoke turned off.